Hi, and welcome to the series How Is It That? You've made a great choice today, and today we will be discussing how is it that two people can observe the exact same data and yet end up in totally different places with how they see it. There are many ways to explain this, but the way we'd like to focus on today is that the brain is constantly managing all kinds of information at the same time. And in any given moment, there are, let's call it 1 million, it's probably a way more than that, bits of data that are coming at you. The brain can only retain from that 1 or 2 million bits of data, can only retain about 127 bits of data. And so let's say that they're toothpicks, right? 1 or 2 million bits of toothpicks are all falling at once. You can only grab 127 of them. So which 127 toothpicks do you think that the brain is most likely to grab? If you've had a chance to think about that, it's more likely that the response that you have is that it will grab what it's most familiar with, right? Or like, have you ever seen those shows where someone has a shopping spree and sometimes they're strategic and they're like, I'm gonna go to the electronics section, right? And other times it's like, oh my gosh, I only have a minute. I'm gonna grab whatever I can throw into the shopping cart in that minute. So the brain is kind of like that, and it sorts it through with what it considers most familiar. And there are seven basic main filters that it kind of brings it through before it decides what it's going to keep, if that makes sense. And so if you take a look at this, right, decide what color you think that is, what you think you're looking at. And if we now put something in front of it, and this something represents the first filter, which is the time-space continuum. All right, so if that's the first filter, then the second one is language. And by language, I mean what your concept is of a certain word. For instance, if you ask a group of 10 people, what does love mean? And to write down 5 things that love means, you're going to have, out of a group of 10 people, you're probably going to have about 100 different responses. People process a word or define it very differently in their mind's eye. So language is that second filter. And the third is memories, things that you've been through, right? If you have ever gotten on a bicycle and learned how to ride it, then you remember the experience of it. That's very different than if you've never laid eyes on a bicycle. So memory is one of those. And the next one is decisions. Now, what do I mean by decisions? Decisions are the things that we kind of decide in our head as we're growing up. So, for instance, you may have come to a decision in your mind's eye that it's not safe to experience your feelings fully. If you've decided that, for whatever reasons you've decided that, maybe you had good reason for deciding that in terms of how you've grown up. But whatever the reasons are, if your mind's eye has determined it is not safe to feel my feelings, then that's a filter, right? So there are limiting decisions and there are also productive decisions. You might decide, for instance, if you've come from a household where you were living at poverty level, that you're going to make sure you get educated and work hard so that you are not at poverty level when you're an adult. That could be a positive decision, could be a limiting decision, or could be that it has hidden limiting decisions. But we'll talk about that some other time. But that's decisions. And the next filter is meta programs. So meta programs are kind of like the bigger thoughts or belief systems that we have. And the mind is simultaneously processing so much data at once that it will rely on these meta programs, the bigger picture that you have in your mind's eye. And that's one of the places that it will sort it through. The next is values and beliefs. And sometimes we have conflicting values, right? You might have a value of wanting to be in a loving, secure relationship, but it might be in conflict with your value of being in a loyal, committed relationship that you're already in if that person is toxic for you. Or let's say it's a job situation. You may value loyalty, but you may also realize that you are not in a job that best supports you and validates who you are. So the conflict between the values can be one of those filters. And next is attitudes. You may have a positive attitude about certain things like change and growth. You may have a negative attitude about the exact same thing. So our attitudes is also another filter. And now when you look through all these filters, what do you see? Obviously, it shifts the color, it shifts the perspective, it shifts the dimensions of how you see and what you see. And if this were our mind's eye experiencing an event, it would be blocking out all of this and only seeing what it can see through here. So, in some ways, the better question is not why is it that two people can see things completely differently, even though it's the same data. Rather, it's more accurate to state how can two people ever see things the same way, since we all have completely different data that's inside of our 7 filters, if that makes sense. And all of that kind of leads to the next thing, which is our internal representation, what we actually think or believe, or kind of what goes through our mind once we see that thing, whatever the thing is. And that will then impact our mood state, which then impacts our physiology, how we physically experience whatever the thing is inside of ourselves. And all of that then impacts what we do, what our behavior actually is. So I hope that makes sense and helps shed a little light as to how two people can see the same exact experience or data and see it completely differently. And the next time we're going to be talking about, so how is it that I can resolve a conflict with someone who just doesn't get me? We don't see eye to eye, we're completely different people. How do we actually work through our issue? So we're going to talk about that next time, and I hope to see you then. Take care.